Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to a meeting of the City Council's Finance Committee. This evening, we are in joint conference with the Board of Education to hear their presentation on their budget. I welcome everyone. I particularly want to make a quick comment and express my appreciation to Chair Burke for having taken the initiative to organize a pre-meeting organizational conversation that included Chair Figdor, the mayor, and myself. That was very helpful, Adam, and I think the public ought to know that you exercised some leadership there in trying to set the stage for this conversation this evening. I'd like to welcome all my colleagues from the City Council who've elected to attend tonight's meeting, and I welcome their participation. However, in the spirit of collegiality that was expressed by Chair Burke's initiative, I'm going to stand down and hand off the gavel to him to conduct this portion of the Finance Committee meeting. And Chair Burke, the floor is yours, as well as the gavel. So it's up to you now to take us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Dion. Thank you for your kind words. It's a pleasure to work with you in this process, and thanks for the opportunity to present the fiscal year 23 school budget to you tonight. Tonight, we have the Board of Education's Finance Committee, including myself, of course, Chair Figdor, and Member Yusuf. We also have student representative from Portland Adult Education, Jody Dayu, with us. We'll primarily be hearing from Superintendent Javier Botana. Just also want to note that we have Kathy Winchenbach, the Executive Director for Finance, Grace Valenzuela, the Executive Director for Multicultural and Multilingual Center, and Gavin Goodall, the Director of IT, with us thus far, and others may join us. I'd just like to say, as Portland continues to rise from the pandemic to the challenges of the moment and more, the school district is a central pillar of Portland's success. For being a great place to raise a family, to run a business, and attract and retain exceptional talent and more. Our schools are our pride because our students are our joy. This year's budget is the result of diligent and rigorous work by the superintendent and staff. It maintains historical investments in equity that were overwhelmingly supported by voters last year, and it keeps increases below the historical rate of inflation this year. And it makes very targeted and prioritized investments to continue better supporting historically and intentionally marginalized students and communities, in part those that you on the council are trying to find ways to support, including our newest members of our community that are here as refugees and asylum seekers. I look forward to tonight's conversation. I deeply appreciate everyone's support for Portland Public Schools, our students and our teachers and staff. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Botana.
Thank you, Chair Burke, and good evening, everyone. We're glad to be here as we do every year for the first of two charter required forums with the Joint Finance Committee and the school board. What we want to do today, as Chair Burke mentioned, is walk you through. This is in essence the same presentation that I did for the school board a couple of weeks ago as we began our budget process. And what we try to do in this presentation is to give you sort of the big picture of what we're doing and why we're trying, why we're doing the things that we're doing, as well as delve into the details of what is in the budget that we are bringing forward. So we welcome your questions. We actually have this broken out into really kind of 4 segments. The first one is, sort of the high picture of what we're doing and why, and then we're going to get into some of the details on the budget itself, the overall impact of the budget on of the school board's proposed budget on the overall city budget, and particularly the taxpayer impact. And then we will talk about some of the things that are new in the budget, as well as our overall goals, what we're trying to achieve through this budget. And then, just a brief aside at the end to talk about federal funding and how that plays into our planning. So with that, I'm going to begin. And so Kathy, if you can go to the next slide, please. This graphic represents what you heard Mr. Burke talk about is, our joint efforts as a community to create an amazing place for children to be educated as part of a larger environment where we're all working together as a community to create a sustainable and equitable place for families to live, to raise their children, and to aspire to everything that we all want for each other. So that's represented here by our Portland Promise graphic, where equity, making sure that we remove the barriers that have traditionally meant that some people get everything out of that dream and other people don't, and that it's removing those barriers that make it systematically some people that do and other people that don't. And the goals that we have are around achievement, around educating the whole student, and understanding that people are the foundation for that. And so that's what this graphic represents. And the reason that we keep coming back to this, if you can go to the next slide, Kathy, is that we know that this is not unique to Portland, but it is very much still true in our community today, that when you look at specific groups of students, they don't have the same outcomes as a result of their education as other students. And so what you see in these next two slides is, what does performance on the current state assessment, which is different from what you've seen in previous years. This is a new state assessment, and I know that everybody is frustrated with changes in states assessments, which make it hard to have a continuous line. And so at this point, we don't have a comparison to state performance, but you can see for our purposes here, the difference between the left-hand side of that graph, where whether you're looking at language arts or whether you're looking at mathematics, what you're seeing on the left-hand side are students who do not have IEPs, who do not have special education needs, and on the right-hand side, the performance of students who do have special education needs. And you can see that, the performance represented with green representing students who are proficient or above proficient, and the red being those students who aren't, is much higher for students with special education needs. And in the next slide, you see the same story for students who are English language learners, students who are exited, so students who have actually been in our English language program, is that middle column, and then students who never were English learners on the right-hand side. And you can see that, again, for our English language learners, their performance is, very much significantly lower than for students who exited the program or never needed English language services. And that's true whether you look at language arts at the top or mathematics at the bottom. And then next slide, Kathy. I do want to point out that what we do know is that the work that we're doing does make a difference. And so this is a slide that looks at the historical performance of our students in the middle grades on that same test that you just saw earlier, when you look at it over time, you see that in an area where we have invested a significant amount of energy and effort over the last few years, which is middle school mathematics. It's the first place that we started with our math implementation. You can see that we have we're seeing some really significant and valuable growth in that area. So, and the next slide is another sort of take on that same story, which is our suspensions, comparing current suspensions to suspensions back in the 1920 year, which is the last year that was sort of a regular school year. And you can see that we have fewer suspensions in this same period of time, and that they're slightly less disproportionate than they were back in 1920. Again, an area where we've spent a significant amount of attention, where the board has changed board policy to encourage and incentivize a different approach to how we address students and support them. And I think that is being reflected in the data. Next slide, please, Kathy. Just a little bit to contextualize. I know that we have some new counselors, and it's always helpful for everyone to just sort of take a little bit of a step back in history to see some of the work and how we've been approaching this. And so this slide you've seen before is, the FY19 through 21, and where we went and built our investments as we look at creating that kind of a school system that is going to achieve better results for all students, but really focusing on supporting the students that traditionally have gotten the least from the system. And so, our strategy throughout has been to maintain the great programs and services that we have in place, while at the same time adding in additional supports and prioritizing new expenses that are targeted to meeting those needs. And so you can see how that's evolved over these past, over those 3 years. And then last year, if you can go to the next slide, Kathy, which was the year that we really were able to move our needle forward with almost $3 million in investments. Many of you recall the significant conversations that we had about those things. And, this sort of summarizes where we made those investments last year. So, final slide on this segment. I just wanted to sort of give you a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of what I mean when I say that we're working on the same things that Chair Burke described in your work, and we have the same concerns that the city has. And you can see here over time how our investments have focused on those areas that are, targeted to the needs of the students who have traditionally not gotten everything from the school system that others get. So whether it's our social workers, our investment in social workers, or in our behavioral health supports, our family engagement through the multilingual department, our pre-kindergarten investments, or our youth development work, as well as the increase in staff that works with our students who are English language learners. You can see here both the number of staff that have been added over the years in those positions, and you can see the cost associated with those investments. So you can see that over these 5 years, we've nearly doubled our investment in these areas. So our budget this year, which we're going to get into some detail on that now, is the theme is focus on teaching and learning. So next slide, Kathy. The reason that we're calling it that is because we understand that the only thing that is really going to make a difference in the long run is the extent to which the students experience, how they interact with the content, with their teachers, with the staff that are there to support them, is what's going to make the difference. And so when we think about what are we trying to achieve with this year's budget, first and foremost, as Chair Burke said, is maintaining those historic investment levels that we've been able to put in place to support the work that we're trying to do, and not slipping backwards. And, obviously trying to do that in a context that is, respectful of the taxpayers and also understanding of the financial realities that, that we're all facing as, taxpayers and our individual lives, working with, what is, has been a very, high consumer price index growth over the past year. So, that's first and foremost, being able to maintain our investments, and then really trying to advance our core priorities. And one of the realities that we've faced, and I think that this is not a surprise to anyone, is that in the context of having to run schools in a pandemic, we've not been able to move and realize the full return on investments that we would have wanted to do. We've had to slow down, put things off to the side. And so what we're really trying to do as we think about this coming year is to focus on execution, fully realizing the investments that we've made and bringing those to fruition. And then, really trying to deepen our work is the sort of in a nutshell, what we're trying to do is just to continue to stay on the same course and really make sure that we realize all of the potential from the investments that we've made. And then we have, and we will describe shortly, some additional investments that are mostly achieved with non-general fund revenue sources. So things that have their own funding stream or are paid for with savings elsewhere. Those are the kinds of things that we are advancing in this budget. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, at the end, we'll talk a little bit about lagging process to use our federal funds to support some of those priorities that we know exist, but that we are not including in our general fund budget proposal at this time. So let's get right into the budget. And so first, just at a high level, what you may have read in the paper or have seen in some of our advanced materials, this is what our budget proposal looks like. It raises the total cost of education in Portland from 126.5 to 132.9, so about a $6.5 million increase, which represents a 5.1% increase over last year's budget. And that's a little bit less than what last year's increase was over FY21, which was a 5.5% overall increase. And the impact on the tax rate is calculated to be a 4.1% increase, and that's just slightly higher than what it was overall last year, which was a 3.9 increase. Next slide, please. So I just want to take a moment to let you know that we've done a tremendous amount of work to get to that place that you just saw. When we presented our preliminary budget to our finance committee back at at the end of January, beginning of February, right after we had our estimate of funding from the state. This first column shows you what our budget looked like. So it looked like, we were increasing significantly more than what you just saw in the previous page. And that was really driven by, significant increases in our personnel, our non-personnel, which was up about 8%, and, a very large increase in debt service. I just want to, take a moment to talk about two aspects of that, because the first one, the personnel, you can see that we've been able to reduce that significantly from its original number. And that was, and we'll be talking a little bit later about some of the, strict enforcement of some staffing formulas that we've used this year, and, identifying some, bits and pieces of vacancies that were in the budget that we were able to sort of scrub and clean out that have allowed us to reduce that personnel budget, which, as you know, is by far the largest part of our budget. And then I want to just thank Brendan O'Connell and the city for their collaboration in thinking about how to bond our debt service in ways that allow us to, defer some of our expenses into future years, so that we're able to manage our debt and just do bonding just in time to be able to cover the expenses as they're coming up from the bulk of this increase was driven by the fact that we are, in full construction mode at the remaining 3 out of the 4 buildings for our future projects. And so our ability to work with Brendan to figure out how to build out the bonds for that was incredibly helpful in getting those numbers down significantly, as you see there. Next slide, Kathy. And so this gives you, at a detailed level, the difference between last year's budget and what we are proposing for this year. So you can see that our personnel budget is up about 4.5%. Our non-personnel budget, excluding the debt service, is up about 7%. It was 8% in our original estimate. So we've also been able to reduce that some. And debt service was up a tremendous amount, 30-some%, and is up only 7% in the current budget. And then you can see the revenue streams for that. I think Kathy's going to get into more detail about it, but I think at a high level, important for the council to understand some of the ways in which we're doing this, because we do have less state funding than what we received last year. So we're actually down $2.5 million over what we wound up receiving last year in terms of the estimate from the state. So a very significant drop in, about 10% in state revenue. And so use of our fund balance across the board. So both our unassigned fund balance. We'll talk a little bit more about how we're using our CTE fund balance, and also the debt service assigned fund balance that you approved last July is really helpful in being able to offset some of those increases in debt service that we see for this year and in subsequent years. And so that's how we were able to manage the budget to get to the place where we are today as we bring this budget to you for first review. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kathy, who's going to get into more of the details about our expenditures, some of the areas where we're feeling pressure, and also, some of the details on state funding and so on.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. For those astute viewers who might have noticed on the first slide, there's a math error, which I will fix. I will correct that for publication. So this is a FY23 budget overview for expenditures and revenue, and it's basically showing three main components of each. And
Kathy?
starting, yes,
Kathy?
yes.
Before we begin, Chair Burke, I just want to bring your attention that one of the counselors has a question. I'll defer to you as to when you'll receive questions from the council or others, but I just wanted to bring to your attention, you might want to declare a rule, quote unquote, as to how you'll take that. All right?
Yes.
Down now. Thank you.
No, thank you for your clarity and communication there. If possible, I'd like to let the superintendent and staff proceed through the presentation and take questions and some at the end, if possible. Okay, thank you.
So this slide is showing three main components of expenditures and revenues. And starting with the budgeted expenditures, salary and benefits increased 4.2 million or 4.3% over FY22. Our debt services was mentioned, increased 666,000 or approximately 7%. And then all other expenditures increased 9.2%. As far as revenues that are shown on the slide, they're comprised of non-tax revenue that increased slightly by 1.6%. The use of fund balance is increasing by 1.2 million this year, and the resulting property tax levy is expected to increase by 4.8 million and 4.8%. The resulting increase in both the budgeted expenditures and revenues is the 5.1% that we saw on the first slide. So proceeding to the next slide, this slide shows the cost drivers. And so our main cost drivers are salary and benefits, and salary and benefits represent approximately 80% of the total budget. And they've increased by, again, approximately 4.2 million, 4.3% over FY22. We mentioned that debt service increased by approximately 666,000, 7% over FY22. And this is due to the issuance of new bonds, primarily to support our three remaining BFOF, our building for our future projects at Longfellow, Presumpscot, and Reike Elementary Schools. And as was also mentioned, our debt service payments will be structured to pay interest only for FY23. And we're also planning to use a quarter of our debt service reserve, which we'll talk about in a moment, to offset these additional costs. The other large expenditure category of change is contracted services. And contracted services as a category increased 1.8 million or 19.9%. The budget book that's published on our website shows the accounts and a lot of the dollars that make up these categories. But essentially, we had private transportation costs increase, our tuition, repairs and maintenance, our rentals, and these include the charges for the use of city facilities, our liability insurance, and other services. And our other services primarily include software license renewals, which are now required to be reported under contracted services by the state. So there was a little bit of a shifting in category change. So our next slide is going to transition to revenue. And the pie chart shows the breakdown of our revenue graphically. So you can see that approximately 78% of our revenue is comprised of property taxes. 15% is our state EPS funding, and all other is 7%. And the next slide shows the FY23 revenue budget in a little greater detail. So this one shows again our property tax levy increasing, our state EPS subsidy increasing by $899,000. And that's really primarily due to our accounting for the debt service reserve as part of our fund balance, not budgeted FY22 revenue here. So the state had notified us in July of FY22 that we would receive an additional $6.2 million in subsidy, which is reflected in our amended FY22 budget. The board and the council approved our using $1.3 million to place grant-funded custodian salary and benefits back on the local budget. We used $1.5 million to maintain the combined FY22 tax rate. And then we set up a reserve for debt service of the remaining $3.4 million. So that reserve for debt service is not in the FY22 subsidy figure you see here because of the way we're using those funds. But when we compare apples to apples for an analysis of the EPS subsidy, we are looking at the total subsidy calculation for Portland year over year, and we have reported that is, we've experienced a loss there or a decrease in subsidy. All other is shown here as federal revenue, and this decrease reflects the Maine Care revenue for the BREATHE program that we do not anticipate receiving. It does include the federal program monies for food service, which are projected to be down slightly. Our total non-tax revenue is largely impacted by food service. So currently the federal government is subsidizing the school meal programs. So local meal revenue is down. However, next year, the state is expected to pay for what we're referring to as the family's portion of meals. So the projected state revenue is up significantly in this area. They're going to cover that portion for us. The use of fund balance, we're using more of our fund balance in FY23 to minimize the tax impact. And we have a separate slide after the slide to discuss the details of that. So next slide, please. There we go. So this next slide shows the use of our fund balance in a little bit greater detail and by fund. The superintendent recommended budget's planning to use $1 million of the unassigned fund balance or reserves to reduce the amount of property taxes to be raised by the school department. So that's this first line down here. Our CTE program receives a portion of the state subsidy specific to career and technical education each year, and any unspent funds accumulate in a reserve for this purpose. So we are proposing using a portion of this restricted fund balance for CTE in FY23. And I believe we'll review more of those specifics in later slides on our investments. And we mentioned the reserve for debt service earlier in the presentation. We would like to use a quarter of that reserve for debt service in FY23, and that represents the $850,000 that we'd be using. And then we're also showing the breakdown by fund, the general fund, including everything other than adult ed and food service. And the amount of fund balance that we use for adult ed and food service has historically been the amount that we needed to balance those budgets and minimize the tax impact whenever possible. This next slide shows the tax impact once again. The school tax rate after revaluation was $6.77 for FY22, and the new tax rate after revaluation is $7.05 for FY23. This slide also shows the tax rate before the revaluation in FY22, which based on the property tax valuation of $8.2 billion was $12.15 prior to revaluation. So the property tax revenue could increase by $677,000 solely from the increase in property tax valuation. So this means that we could increase our FY22 budget by $677,307 with no increase in the tax rate. And then thereafter, we're seeing each additional budget increase of approximately $1 million, resulting in about a 1% tax increase, or roughly 7 cents. So how does this translate for the taxpayer? Since we're adding 28 cents to the school portion of the tax rate, the school tax rate would increase to $7.05, as just mentioned. And for a home with a median assessed value in Portland, per the city assessor, this of $365,000, this represents an annual increase in property taxes of about $102. So I think this concludes the budget overview portion. Would you like me to proceed?
Yes, please. So again, you've seen our theme, and next slide, you know what our goals are for this budget. And so what are some of the things that you actually, that are actually in this budget that are new investments to support our equity efforts? And so that's what you see in this next slide. And I'm not going to go into a significant level of detail on these. If you look at our budget book, each of them has sort of a specific narrative and detailed tables with it. So if you want to know exactly what's in there, but I am going to spend a little bit of time on this first one because I had mentioned earlier the fact that one of the things that we did this year was rigorous implementation of our staffing formulas. We've actually developed new staffing formulas for things like our social work, ELL, and special education staffing. We've had those for a couple of years. We've had one for elementary for a long time, but now we've also brought that level of work to determining how many specialists we have in buildings for things like music, art, and PE, as well as for our middle school and high schools. And so in doing that, we were able to identify a specific equity staffing enhancement for the high schools that I'm going to describe in a little bit of detail in a second. But these are the things that are in our budget that are new this year, things that we believe are advancing our efforts to move to being a more equitable school system, while at the same time, you can see it's a relatively small investment, because many of these actually come with their own funding structure. So actually that staffing enhancement that I'm going to talk about is a net negative over our previous high school spending of about $25,000. And I'll explain that in a second. But we've also restructured our librarians so that we have a librarian in every one of our elementary schools, with the exception of Longfellow and Presumpscot, that will share half a librarian, but that's still a significant increase in the amount of librarian time. And that's with, as part of our efforts to really have strong content level instruction in our schools, and we believe that that resource will help us in that front. We are adding a quarter of a Make It Happen coordinator at Casco Bay. It's the only school in the district that doesn't have a full-time Make It Happen coordinator. So they have a 0.75. So this will make that position be a full-time position, and something that we think is also part of what will help make it happen a successful program across the way. The largest investment that we're making is one that we believe is an enduring investment. And these are basically things that we paid for using federal funds that we are moving into the general fund budget. And these are all of our curriculum and assessment purchases. So things like our textbooks for mathematics, for our phonics program, and things along those lines are currently being funded out of a variety of grant funds, and we're moving those into our general fund. And that's the bulk of the overall investment. 320 out of the 430 is coming from that particular line. Then pre-K expansion. This is continuing the work that we've been engaged in. We're only adding one classroom as opposed to two, with the idea that we will do two next year, and that will complete our originally planned expansion for pre-kindergarten. The reason that this nets out at 32,000 is that for the most part, the costs associated with pre-kindergarten are covered by the state in terms of added revenue for those students. So that generally pays for the teacher and ed tech in the classroom. We are committing to having a half-time social worker to work across all of our partner sites. We have, at this point, a good number of those sites that have their own needs, and where our social workers in the class, where we have a classroom in one of our schools, our social workers in the schools are able to provide the support to those students. We do not have a way to do that for our partnerships with YFO, with Catherine Morrow, with the Children's Odyssey, and so on. And so we're adding that, and that's where you see the additional cost there. We have, as some of you know, have been engaged for the better part of a year and a half now, really trying to figure out what can we do to improve outcomes for our Latinx students. And one of the things that has emerged through those conversations is the value of trying to make opportunities for our Latinx students to see a pathway to the future, something that isn't readily discernible for many of them through our traditional high school experience. And so through this investment, which is the $177,000 in CTE funds that you saw when Kathy talked about the use of reserves, that funding is going to allow us to have a teacher who works on the coordination with the classroom teachers for students whose first language isn't English, as well as Spanish-speaking ed techs to work with the students as they engage in programs at our Career and Technical Center. RISE is, this is a compliance move. The state asked us last year, required us last year, if you will, to ensure that we provide education services to students with IEPs all the way till they're 22 years old. So last year, we already had some additional resources that we put in place for that, but, that covered the kids who went from, 21 to 22, and this now allows us to capture the full spectrum of kids who were still 19 last year, or who were still 20 last year, but are now going to be 21. And so those are this is an added ed tech position to allow us to provide services to those students. At Portland Adult Ed, we're doing a conversion of some of our temp staff salaries, so not people, but actual salary compensation that we have for hourly employees, and instead converting that into a full-time ELL position at Portland Adult Ed. So that gives them an additional full-time dedicated teacher devoted to teaching English to our newcomers. And so that's part of that. And we also are increasing compensation for the executive director for the Foundation for Portland Public Schools to make the compensation for that position sort of aligned with the compensation level for EDs and foundations that are over $1 million. We've done a tremendous amount of work in the past few years to really grow the work of the foundation, and we've gone over $1 million this year, and So this is a retention move to be able to keep us moving in that direction. And so that's the full sort of outline of all of the new investments that are in our budget. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes, next slide, Kathy, just talking about, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but one of our board members, Nyla Biliou, is in the attendees section of the call, and I'm wondering if she could please be moved over to panelist. And sorry for the interruption again.
And I'm assuming that somebody knows how to do that. Not
I'm taken care of.
Thank you. Just spending a couple minutes talking about our staffing formulas, because they're a big part of how we were able to get our budget to where it currently is. And, so this provides an overview of what we're doing. And it's just, our intent here is to create a transparent and rational process for allocating staff to schools on an annual basis. And so, obviously there are some key factors that we take into consideration when we do that. And so it's things like, obviously, the enrollment. You know that our enrollment has decreased by about 1.5%, from last year, and 4.5% since the start of the pandemic. And so, there's by applying these formulas, we're able to really account for those decreases. The master schedule of the school, the type of classes that students are required to have, our class size parameters, as well as how many students a teacher or a specialist can have on their caseload. And so, basically the analysis consists of determining the total number of classes, and then the total number of classes that can be formed based on the total number of, in that first analysis, and the class size guidance. And then, arriving at the FTE, the full-time equivalent of staff that are necessary to be able to provide to those key considerations. Next slide, Kathy. And so this gives you a summary of what the application of those formulas resulted in doing this work this year. And so, if you look at the difference from FY22 to FY23, you can see that we've been able to reduce by 8 positions at the elementary, 2 at the middle, and 9.5 positions at the high school in terms of just classroom positions. And then, a small decrease in the teachers in specials positions at the middle school. And so that's the overall delta of 19.5. That if you look at our budget book, you can see the reductions in positions, and specifically where those reductions take place. So next slide, Kathy. This is specifically for the high school, the way in which that staffing formula works. And so it's basically the total enrollment of the school times the number of classes that each student can take, divided by the class size max, which in our case is 25 for the high school. And then that is divided by the number of sections that a teacher can teach. So how many periods over the day are they assigned to teach? And so you can see those assumptions in the next column: 25 students per class, the number of classes that each student takes, which is different whether they're at our comprehensive high schools or at Casco Bay, and then the number of sections that teachers normally teach over the course of the day. And so this gives you, or actually over the course of the week. And so this gives you the calculations below, the number of classroom positions that we had in 22 versus the ones that we projected for 23. And that gives you the 9.5 positions that we actually were able to reduce by using this formula. So if you go to the next slide, actually just stay on that one for 1 second. I do want to point out that there's a footnote at the bottom that talks about what we did in the case of Casco Bay, which does not function as a truly sort of traditional high school. So even though we went through the exercise and as a result of that exercise, they actually were entitled to 2 additional positions. When we sat down and worked with the school administration, we determined that that wasn't necessary, so we did not add that. But that also was the genesis of that increase in the Make It Happen coordinator that I described earlier. Okay, now you can go on, Kathy. And so one of the things that we were able to do as a result of those significant decreases in the staffing at the high school was to think about a different way in which we could staff. And so what we did is we looked at, sort of different models for how do you equitably address the challenges of working with, a student population that has significant needs. And so what we came up with which is consistent with the way that the state EPS formula also looks at students who are free and reduced lunch. We basically looked at all of the students in each of our comprehensive high schools and weighted those students who have special needs, so students who are economically disadvantaged, as measured by whether they're eligible for free and reduced lunch, students who have special education needs, or students who are English language learners, and weighted those students as 20% more and applied that to the formula that you saw on the previous page. And that resulted in what you see on the next page, Kathy, which is an increase of 5 teachers at Deering and 4 teachers at Portland High School. And, that's measured against those reductions that you had seen. And that's why when you saw the first slide and saw that the cost of the equity enhancements as an investment is actually a negative $24,000, is because of the delta between what we were able to reduce and what we reinstated with the equity enhancement. The difference here is that these are positions now that we will expect will be used to address the challenges of working with students who have those special needs that were identified earlier. So it gives us a place to look at how do we create the kinds of programs and services for students in our comprehensive high schools that have those needs that resulted in this additional funding. So that's the formulas. And as I mentioned earlier, we've used those formulas with elementary grades for as long, for before I started. So that those have been in place, and we've used those fairly consistently. We didn't last year because we didn't know what our enrollment was going to look like as we came back from a year of being largely remote. So we did not do that. And that's why you saw that very significant reduction of 8 classrooms at the elementary level for this coming year. But, that had traditionally been applied, but now doing the same thing for middle schools and high schools in particular is a, consistent, rational, and transparent way of staffing our high schools, which we've never had before. So, moving along, Kathy, there are a number of things that, as we've been working over the course of the year, as we've been talking to the board, as we've been presenting to them on, what are the kinds of things that we still feel that we need put in place. There are a number of things that came from those conversations that are not in the budget that we're reviewing with you today. And so the next few slides give you examples of what those things are. So these are the additional needs that we have not put into the budget this year that are related to student support. So students with special needs, as well as our social work staffing. So you can see one of the things that we've identified is a large number of referrals for special education that wind up not actually requiring special education after they go through the referral process. And so, our theory is that we need to do more upfront to prevent students from falling behind, to be able to, and then be required to go through the evaluation process. So having a consultation team that helps to identify the supports that are needed before is part of what we need to do. And that's what that consultation intervention is. Some staffing for district programs. These are programs that are, sort of in one school, but serve the entire district. Things like our Bridge program, our Breathe program, our functional life skills, FLS programs, and things along those lines. So here are some of the staffing increases that we could use, but we're going to not have in our that are not in our proposed budget, as well as the staffing, the social work staffing increases required by our formula. Next slide. These are some of the needs identified that are tied to our LAU plan and world languages. So I'm not gonna, you can read them, and many of them I'm sure will be familiar to you. SLIFE, for those who don't know, is programming for students who had limited or interrupted formal education. And we added one position last year. So it's one position that shuttles between the two comprehensive high schools. And so we, in time, would like to have that be dedicated one person at each of our schools. And last slide on this, Kathy. Some of the other things that we've identified, we have a grant for a mobile makerspace. We have 0.8 of that position funded using various sources. And part of our need is to identify 0.2 that still has not been funded. And so that's one of the things that's not in the budget. Our district level, we don't have anybody who's dedicated to really supporting English language arts as a content area. We have somebody for math. We have actually several people for math, but nobody in ELA. So that's something that we in time would like to be able to add. And we had a very successful pilot with garden teachers at our elementary schools, and something that many people would like to continue, but we do not have that prioritized in our in the budget that we're sharing with you today. So that's next slide, Kathy. That sort of brings us to how do we leverage our federal funding? Next slide. We're, as you know, have a significant amount of federal funds. The board is delving more deeply into this, but we still have a significant amount of resources that we are able to allocate. And so part of what we're intending to do is, once our budget is on track and underway, is to look at particularly that last list that you saw and see if any of those investments are things that we could potentially use our ESSER funding for. And, you know, I think you all understand that the challenge with that is that those become then things that need to continue into future years, and why we're reluctant to, you know, to put them into ESSER without having significant consultation and conversation with the board. We also committed last year to a participatory budget process, and so aligning those priorities and that participatory budget process is something that, again, the board we will be asking the board to help us to do. So that, I think, is the full presentation. Just, you know, some of the key dates. As you know, we're currently in the segment that we call the school board segment. We're bringing the approved budget to you on April 11th. So the school board is scheduled to vote on a final budget at the April 5th board meeting. There's a hearing and first read of the budget next week. And then you're scheduled to vote on it on May 16th. And obviously the public referendum is scheduled for election day on June 14th. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Superintendent. And thank you, counselors, for your patience as we went through the entire presentation, just to ensure any questions that you may have that were to be answered were addressed in that regard. And Counselor Chung, thank you for your grace and patience in particular. Over to you for your questions and comments.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a lot of questions. They're all around equity and how they're related to our finances. And so my first question is, when a kid is suspended or a kid is not showing up to school, does that affect your overall budget if you have a decrease in the number of kids that show up to school?
It does not.
It does not? You're saying that when we don't have kids who show up to school and you have a decrease in the number of kids that show up in attendance, it does not affect the funding formula?
That's correct.
That's not true. According to what Representative Brennan is saying, and according to all those other things, that's kind of hard to believe, because I had that conversation with Grace about attendance and how that affects. But okay,
are you saying I'm lying?
What's that?
Are you saying I'm lying?
If that's misinformation I'm getting from Grace Valenzuela from Mike Brennan, yes. So I will follow up and find out whether that's accurate or not. So that's my first question is, if kids aren't showing up to school, it doesn't affect, you're saying that doesn't affect funding formula. Is that what you're saying?
If a kid is enrolled in school,
right,
it does not, that kid counts.
So there are no spot attendance records to figure out what your funding formula might be. Okay, then I misheard from Grace Valenzuela and also from Mike Brennan. So well,
Grace,
my
Grace,
question,
Counselor,
Grace is here, so maybe she can help clarify that.
Yeah.
I also see several other folks that seem to like
I think
to
it's
this point.
Interpretation. I don't remember saying that, Councillor Chung. So it's probably you misheard the conversation about that.
Well, I remember having almost a 3-hour conversation with you and also with Mike Brennan about how it was important to have as many kids to show up to school, because there are spot attendance records that affect the funding formula for a number of kids that show up. And so if I'm mistaken, I apologize. But my question then is around attendance. Last year we had, 2 years ago, there were almost 1,400 kids, mostly kids of color and poor white kids, that didn't show up to school. We don't see any statistics around that. I'm just wondering if that's improved, because we also saw that in 2021, the attendance records for Hispanic kids actually got worse compared to 2020. And we've made millions of dollars in equity investments. How are the attendance records for Black kids and brown kids and poor white kids doing? Is it improving? Is it the same, or is it not?
We'll be happy to provide that information for you.
Great. And the second thing is, in years past, we've always had data around test scores based on races. And this is the first year we don't have it. Could we get that too?
Of course.
Thank you. So my other questions around funding are related to Well, the other thing I discovered around the truancy stuff based on your data was that overall suspensions rates went down, which is great. It went down by about 14% based on what I could calculate. But for Black kids, the percentage of Black kids who were suspended, it's a larger percentage compared to the overall, because they were roughly, and the bars were really hard to read. I gave it a really good, generous number of 325 kids compared to 400 in 2020. There were 133 Black kids 32 kids that were suspended in 2022, 21 versus 153 in 20. So the overall percentage of Black kids being suspended was far greater this year than it was the year before. But I just wanted to throw that out there. I would love to get the accurate numbers to see that.
That's inaccurate, and we'll be happy to provide you.
Yeah, I would love to see real numbers as opposed to kind of guessing.
Yes, I'm going to pause here. I see.
But here are my other financial questions.
I'd like to put it over to
I just have
Councillor Dion.
financial questions, Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman Burke. With all due respect, Councillor Chong, I'm going to take over the gavel at this point. The purpose of tonight's meeting, let me state it clearly, is to receive budgetary information from the Board of Education on their proposed budget for the next fiscal year. I would welcome all questions that would help clarify our understanding of that financial proposal. Questions as to the performance of the schools, personnel, the impact of policy will be reserved for another meeting if that's necessary. Hold on.
I apologize. I will ask specific financial questions.
Councillor Chong, you don't have the floor right now. I apologize. All right? I'm giving this caution to the entire committee. We have a specific purpose to accomplish tonight. We will do so respectfully. I will not tolerate any insinuation that anyone here is being less than truthful to the facts that they present. All right? That's out of bounds. I want to be clear about that.
I apologize.
I want to be understood about that.
Yep.
I don't need a reaction. I just need an understanding. All right? So, Chair Burke, my apologies for stepping in. I guess it's the sheriff gene in me. Sometimes you just have to act when you see the opportunity is needed. I will now return the gavel to Chair Burke, and I welcome the questions from my counselors and others on the financial issues presented to us tonight by the Board of Education. Thank you very much, Chair Burke.
Yes, thank you, Chair Dion. Councillor Chong, I heard that you do have some financial questions. I'll come back over to you in a moment. I see member Councillor Trevorrow's hand up.
Thank you. And again, it's so good to see everyone here tonight. It feels like it's been a lot longer than it has been since I was on the other side of this. So I was just really happy to have you guys all join the meeting and see your faces tonight. And I want to express, my sentiment that this is truly a joint effort, that we have utter faith in the leadership of the school district, and we know the goals strongly that you're all working towards. We share the same goals. And so in the spirit of collaboration, I'm glad to see you. So first of all, I just wanted to share a couple of points that I really appreciated from the presentation. The trends at the beginning that you showed, where we have actually seen some progress in the way of achievement over our years of investment. I know that this is something that the board has, over the course of Javier's tenure, really made strategic investments each year towards equity. And it's not something that happens overnight. And so I feel like we're sort of just seeing the beginning pictures of it in the form of concrete data. So that's very encouraging. And yet, of course, we still have a ways to go. And we saw that also very clearly laid out in the tables at the beginning. My financial question. So the slide early on that you showed where you had the February dated original budget. Is that that was like your kind of rollover starting point budget? And state funding, it looks like in terms of dollar amounts, it's up this year by, not actually, it's actually down from last year.
It's down 2.5 million. Kathy, can you just, because I know that some of the way that the slides actually play out because of the timing of last year's budget, what was approved in the budget versus what we actually got, it seems like we actually went up, but we're down $2.5 million over what we received last year.
Okay.
Kathy, can you just make sure that that's correct? And
that is correct. No, I was just going to see if I could share that slide again. And I tried to speak to that one. Where is that one? Yeah,
I'm sure you did. And
No, that's fine. It does look like, let's see, where is it? Oh, goodness. Oh.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's the one here. Non-tax revenue, yes. That the one? It doesn't look like the one. Anyway, there was one that had a footnote at the bottom. Here we go.
Okay.
This one, it looked like our EPS, our state subsidy actually went up, but that was because we reserved the 3.4 million for the reserve for debt service. So it's not reflected here.
Okay.
And that's coming in FY22. So FY22 does not include that. And if we did, we'd show our
okay, so FY22
is lower
would
than
actually
would be higher.
Got it. So what was the delta then originally between just like a rollover budget and then the gap with state funding?
Initially, before they even reduced the mill rate, it was like 6 million. It was big.
Oh, wow.
And then the mill rate got reduced and the valuation came into as well. And then those pieces, we've done multiple tax impact projections, but this one was, I think, once things settled a little bit, that's what we were seeing on the one that's 2.8.
Yeah. This one actually we had already received the preliminary.
Yes.
That still went down. I think at the time it was 1.5 million less, but then because of the changes in the debt service, then it went down to 2.5 million.
Okay.
Yep.
And I remember from last year, there were some conversations with the legislative delegation. They were kind of predicting that this year we might actually get more funding. Do you remember that, or am I remembering that correctly? And did that play out? I
mean, I think, to sort of underscore Kathy's point, the mill rate dropped. If not for the mill rate dropping, we would have seen a much bigger decrease in the funding. When the delegation talks about more money, the governor has put a tremendous amount of investment into public schools over the past 4 years with the legislature. So, the mill rate has dropped from, I think it was 787 maybe 4 years ago to 710 this year. So that's because of that, we have not seen the dramatic decreases that we would have otherwise seen. There was altogether over $80 million in additional funding that was put into general fund by the state. But because of our valuation and the way that the formula works, we haven't seen the increases. I mean, we saw a significant increase last year. At the last minute, when we thought we were down 2 million, then we were up by 3.5 million because of the additional money that came in when the legislature acted. That was a tremendous, and we were able to set aside the $3.5 million for debt service reductions over the next few years, which are part of what we were able to do this year to get the tax rate down where it was by being able to tap into that reserve.
Okay, good. I'm going to let my colleagues jump in at this point, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Trevorrow. And Councillor Fournier, thanks for your patience, and over to you.
Of course, thank you so much, and thank you for this presentation. It will definitely take a little bit more to digest to get, I think, to more data-specific questions, but just two of the things that jumped out is I know there are quite, a few needs that you had listed that you would hope to address, but, when budget time comes, there, are little things that we have to shelve. So I just wonder if you don't have it tonight, that's okay. But I would just be curious to know what the value is of those needs not addressed. So, we see where the investments are, but I would just be interested to know, what is it that we would hope to fund if it wouldn't impact the tax rate and we really could invest the way that we wanted to, what would that look like? And then my second question is for the remaining ESSER funds. I don't know that I saw what that fund balance was, and I could have missed it. There was a lot of numbers, but those were my two primary questions. But again, really, truly appreciate the board being here tonight and presenting this. It's just a ton of work, and I really appreciate the work that you guys do.
Thank you. And we do have just to let you know, the board's finance committee has asked for that information. We have, we have been working through those things, so we can provide those easily to you. So we'll follow up.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chair. Like my colleagues, I want to thank the superintendent for presenting and preparing this budget. Remind everyone, along with the comments that we just heard, that this is still very much the superintendent's proposed budget. It has to go through the finance committee or the school finance committee. And so we're still assessing what he has prepared for us. So to that end, I want to thank him. As we just heard, the rollover budget would have been a ridiculous increase that I don't think anyone in this room would have felt would be appropriate given our situation, looking at the municipal budget side. So I appreciate the effort that has been put to bring it down to a more reasonable level. I did want to talk about the decrease in state funding and your decreased enrollment, and how the enrollment that you report, the final enrollment from the year that's done at the end of October, how that affects state funding. Can you give us just a little bit of insight? And if you don't mind also, because your decreased enrollment is significant compared to years past, if you don't mind giving the council a little bit of insight of what has driven that decreased enrollment from what you've collected, because I know your team has looked into that as well. And then I have a couple other questions.
Yeah. So the enrollment is one of the key variables in the EPS funding. So, the number of students by grade is a big part of how the state funding is determined. So definitely enrollment is, a key factor. As I mentioned, for EPS purposes, I think our decrease, which is averaged out over, I don't remember, Kathy, 2 or 3 years. So it's an average enrollment for, I don't remember if it's 2 or 3 years that they combine, is down about 1.5%. From last year's combination average to this year's combination average. So that's one of the big drivers, along with, the valuation, the community's valuation, because the way that the EPS works, and for those of you who attended the community forum, we have we go into this in significant depth in terms of, helping people to understand how those, two factors, the community's valuation drives what the state says that we are supposed to pay versus what they're supposed to pay. And so, the cost of education, the cost of how much we should spend on schools is, driven directly by the number of students and the types of students that we have and things along those lines. But then the how much we're expected to pay versus the state paying is what is different based on the valuation of the community. And so just to put that in context, other service center communities like, Augusta or Biddeford or Bangor or Lewiston, they have anywhere from, 40 to, in the case of Lewiston, I believe 70% of their funding coming from the state. And in our case this year, it's less than 20%.
So the averaging enrollment from October 2020 and October 2021.
And that's down 1.5%. And also to put it in context, and we have slides on this as well from the community forum, that's representative of the state, where, we actually have a table that shows us against, all of those communities that I mentioned, but also Scarborough and Falmouth and Yarmouth and so on. And, our enrollment is down 1.5%, and it's a range from 1 to 4% across the state.
Thank you for that. That's always really helpful to keep into the context. So a comment, and then or two comments rather. First, about your investments in PATH in our CTE programming and using the reserves. I just want to applaud the thinking behind that. As I understanding, you're using reserves funds, so it doesn't impact the bottom line of the budget. And because you'll be hopefully increasing enrollment in CTE, you then by that same formula that you just explained, increasing funding, CTE funding. So in essence, it pays for itself to provide ELL support in PATH programming. So I think that just needs to be reaffirmed, because that's a really good strategy. Last thing that I'll say, again, on the enrollment drop-off, as I understand it, you lost about 71 students at the high school level. Given the new equity staffing formula, you just told us that Casco Bay High School deferred on the proposal to add 2-point-something FTEs, which tells me that the way that they're running that school, perhaps because they have a capped enrollment and makes it easier to plan year over year, seems to be incredibly efficient, even given the equity staffing formula. So I'm wondering if in the future there's thought about having some other alignment, be it capped enrollment at the other two comprehensive high schools, or some other way to operate them so that the equity staffing formula that you just mentioned has a similar effect in those buildings where it's ran so efficiently, we should say, that it doesn't have such a large impact on our spending, on our staffing. So, and that's more of a thought than a comment. We don't have to get into that right now. Other than that, I look forward to seeing the rest of the process and hearing other councilors' questions and comments. Again, thank you for all the work getting it to this point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Mayor Snyder.
Thank you, Chair Burke. And thank you, Superintendent Botana. I'm just going to start by saying, which I say every time I'm in a meeting with you, I don't know how you've done it over the course of the pandemic. And thank you for leading the schools and for sticking with it. As hard as it is for all of us, kids and families, I can't even imagine. So thank you. I also want to just point out how grateful I am at the collaboration that I know is happening between our city manager and superintendent and senior staff. I think improvements in communication have been made, and I think that's really positive. So thank you for investing in those relationships and spending the time. My thanks go to the school side and the city side. I think, I'm just giving some comments here, but when I think about this work that we're doing and I look at the timeline that you've put together and these joint meetings, I go back to why is this stuff built in, and why do we focus on being partners in this work? And when the Charter Commission last time around in 2010 built in these required joint meetings, it was in response to everything that the district and the city had been through during the 2008 recession and some difficult years. And so my hope is that we can really use this schedule that you've put together to work together to land at the very right place. As a member of the council, our job is to approve a number amount. And then the experts, you all, figure out how to do this incredibly hard work with students. So that's where I'm focused is on that top line number. And I appreciate all of the information and the work that you all are doing. But I know that that's my job, is to make sure that we're working together to pass along a top line school budget that allows good teaching and learning to happen in the district. So that's really my focus as we make our way through this. I'm looking at the schedule and realizing that on April 11th, so 2.5 weeks from now, you'll give us, the school board will actually give us the school board's version of the budget, and then that'll get referred. And so on the 14th of April, we'll take it into our City Council Finance Committee meeting jointly with you all. So I look forward to that next step also, and just sort of put that out there to remind folks we do have a little bit of time before the school board's budget lands with the City Council's Finance Committee. And we have an excellent Finance Committee, and I'm looking forward to seeing that work and being part of that work. And also recognizing that I think we have the full council with us here tonight. So there's a lot of investment in this work, and we all know that it's very important work and it's hard work that you guys have done. So my only question after all that talking is, Kathy, you referred to the $3.4 million in debt reserve, and Councilor Trevorrow asked a question about it. And I just want to make sure that I understand that. It sounds like you're using some of that funding in FY23 and reserving some for a future fiscal year. Is that right?
That is correct. 1/4 of it, the $850,000 we're using for FY23.
And thank you. Is the plan there just to use it in is the strategy to use it over the next several years?
I believe so. Yes.
That's it. How much we use on any specific year would be driven by what are the specific increases. I think, I mentioned earlier that we've had really productive conversations. Brendan has been amazing at helping us to think through, what do we need now? What do we need, a year from now, and so on. We've always looked at that as that's why we brought it last year as a reserve to be able to take on some of the, significant increases in debt service being brought on by the forced school bond, so that we can carry over to a time when the pension obligation bond rolls off and we go back to sort of a more static level of debt service need, which is in 2026. So that's kind of how we've thought about it as a quarter. We know that the quarter gets us what we need this year. Maybe we need to use, a third of what's left next year. Maybe we need to use half of what's left next year.
Thank you. That's helpful information. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilor Chong.
Thank you, Chair. I think everyone who knows me that I've been around equity work, especially around education, for about 25 years, and I'm incredibly passionate about making sure that all the kids of color and kids in poverty do better in school, because I don't want them to go into a life of poverty or not having opportunities. So I'm incredibly passionate about it. So I apologize about my passion. So, and because of my passion, I do a lot of things on the side. And one of the things that Superintendent and I did was meet with President Glenn Cummings and also with President of Educate Maine, Jason Judd. And we talked about how can the community offer things for the public schools to build on our equity work. And President Cummings offered 3 things. And I'm just wondering to Superintendent Botana what happened. The 3 things that he offered was he would expand the capacity to offer ELL certification for Portland Public College schools. And President of Educate Maine, Jason Judd, said that he would help write grants to offset those costs. That was one. The second thing he offered was he would offer USM fellow students of color to help with tutoring, sort of like make it happen at no cost to US Sound, to Portland Public Schools. That wasn't followed up. And the third thing he offered up was he said that he could. I have the emails, Javier. But the third thing that he also
Councillor Chong,
said
I'm
was,
curious how this refers to Diane's comments about what we're focusing on this
is
evening.
trying to offer up help to decrease our dependence or decrease our programming or improving our programming because these things are free or there could be other revenues. I'm just wondering if they also help to improve our equity work, such as having our Department of School social work students from US Sound will help with the listening sessions to help you change your curriculum about how you address Hispanic kids. I'm just wondering, and the fourth thing was I also got Hannaford to offer up possible donations and volunteering for a walking school bus. How can the community help? If we're trying to help you, what can we do?
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, point of order.
Thank you. Thank you. I look to you, Chair Dion, as your fellow counselor, and I'm in your house, so I appreciate you leaning forward.
Now, and I apologize because we've invited you into our house. I have tried to be as general as possible in my commentary. Let me be more specific. With all due respect, Councillor Chong, you know how I feel about your passion, your commitment to students of color. The issue of performance programming or other such initiatives are outside the scope of this meeting this evening. We have done our work tonight to look at the budget that's being proposed. Our role as counselors is to see it from a 40,000 point view. Ours is not our duty or right to delve into the subsets of a budget to assess the performance of the school department or the Board of Education. That's not our role this evening. I appreciate your passion, and I'm sure it's shared by others on the committee and on the Board of Education. And in that light, Superintendent, if there's a possibility for members of this council or others to participate in some manner of process so that we can assess what is going on in terms of truancy or absenteeism, I think that's a worthwhile venture. It's critical to the success of a student's achievement at school. It's also critical to our sense of neighborhood as city councilors. But that conversation and that process belongs outside the scope of this meeting tonight. So I again caution the councilors, with all due respect, as my colleagues, the purpose tonight is to discuss a budget from a 40,000 foot view, nothing more. There'll be other opportunities to engage the Board of Education, the Superintendent's office, and we will avail ourselves of those opportunities. So, God, I'm trying to be as clear as I can about what we're supposed to be doing tonight. All right, so I now again will stand down and turn this back to Chair Burke.
Thank you, Chair Dion. Councillor Ali.
Thank you. Councillor Dion, I will try to lower it to 20,000. 40,000 is too high for me. I want to thank Superintendent and school board members for an amazing presentation. Thank you for the work that you've done over the years. As someone who works with students, I've seen some of the results in the young people that I work with. So thank you. I'm looking forward to see how this process will move forward. And Mayor, thank you for working with the superintendent and to have a very, how do we call it, a very good process away from where we have been the past couple of years. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So with that, I think those that have had an interest in asking clarifying questions or seeking further information about the budget at the level at which Councillor Dion set forth has occurred, I'll just give a last pass if anybody has a question before we close, or I pass the gavel back. Yes, Member Figdor, Chair Figdor.
I just wanted to thank everyone tonight for your time and for delving into to the school budget. I want to thank the superintendent. I just hadn't had an opportunity to say how appreciative I am of your spending the time with us hearing the core work that we're seeking to do, and understanding more about the day-to-day of what we're doing at Portland Public Schools. So thank you so much. Thank you to Chair Burke, and I really look forward to continuing in this process.
Thank you, Chair Figdor. Superintendent, any last words from you?
Just also extend my thank you to Council always for your questions and support. Councilor Chung, I will be happy to have the conversation one-on-one, as I've done time and again, about those particular things that you've asked, because your understanding and my understanding are, not completely aligned. So be happy to re-engage around those things.
Anytime. Thank you.
Superintendent. Yes. So thank you all for hosting us this evening. I deeply appreciate the conversation we've been able to have, and the thoughtful collaboration that has occurred to bring us into this evening, and we'll continue as we work on this year's budget. And the gavel's back to you, Councilor Diane.
Thank you, Chair Burke. It's a pleasure to work with you. I want to thank the superintendent, staff of the school department, and members of the Board of Education. I also extend my appreciation for counselors who are not members of this committee for taking the time to express themselves and gather the facts that they'll need for future decisions. So our joint conference with the school department and the Board of Education has now come to an end.